Welcome, weary traveller, to the Quiet Conquest.
As the evening deepens and the world outside softens into twilight, we invite you to embark on a tranquil journey through the intricate corridors of English history. Tonight, we will gently explore
The profound and often turbulent period known as the Wars of the Roses. A series of dynastic civil wars fought intermittently in England between approximately 1455 and 1487. This is a story not of sudden, dramatic events alone, but of the slow, simmering tensions that eventually erupted, reshaping the English monarchy and societal fabric.
Our focus will be on the verifiable, the documented, and the widely accepted understanding of this pivotal era, allowing the historical facts to speak for themselves, softly illuminating the past. The very name, Wars of the Roses, evokes a poetic
image, referencing the heraldic badges associated with the two main rival factions, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, and the House of York, represented by a white rose.
However, it is important to note that this emblematic title was not widely used during the conflicts themselves, gaining popularity much later, particularly through the influential historical plays of William Shakespeare.
The reality was a more complex and often brutal struggle for the crown, rooted in intertwined claims to the throne, the ambitions of powerful noble families, and the weaknesses of a reigning monarch. To truly understand these conflicts, we must first set the scene in 15th century England. This was a realm still deeply immersed in the medieval framework of feudalism, where powerful aristocratic families, often with vast landholdings and private armies, wielded significant influence.
The concept of a unified nation was still evolving,
and loyalties were often more personal, directed towards a specific lord or a particular branch of the royal family, rather than an abstract state. The English monarchy, while theoretically supreme, relied heavily on the cooperation and support of its leading nobles. The direct cause of the Wars of the Roses lay in the succession crisis within the Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England since the 12th century. Both the houses of Lancaster and York were direct descendants of King Edward III, who reigned from 1327 to 1377. The Lancastrian claim stemmed from Edward II's third son, John of Gaunt, whose son, Henry Bolingbroke, had usurped the throne
in 1399 to become Henry IV. This act of usurpation, though initially accepted, created a precedent and a latent instability regarding the legitimacy of the Lancastrian line. The Yorkist claim derived from Edward II's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, whose lineage, through female descent, could be argued as more senior by strict primogeniture.
This intricate web of familial relationships and differing interpretations
of inheritance law provided the fertile ground for discord. The immediate catalyst for widespread conflict was the reign of Henry VI, a king who ascended to the throne as an infant in 1422. His long minority, coupled with later periods of mental
incapacitation, created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles were eager to fill. The loss of vast English territories in France towards the end of the Hundred Years' War further exacerbated domestic tensions, as returning soldiers and disgruntled lords sought new avenues for power and wealth. The fragile peace that often
characterized earlier medieval periods gave way to a deeply fractured political landscape, where factionalism and mistrust became pervasive. Our exploration will not sensationalize the battles or dwell on the dramatic aspects,
but rather seek to understand the underlying causes, the societal impacts, and the long-term consequences of these conflicts.
We will examine how the wars disrupted, yet in some ways also shaped, daily life for peasants, merchants, and the nobility.
We will gently uncover the role of propaganda, the significance of heraldry, and the enduring psychological toll of prolonged civil strife on a kingdom. The shifting loyalties, the intricate family trees, and the surprising turns of fortune will be presented with a calm, scholarly detachment, allowing the facts to weave their own compelling narrative. This is a story of a kingdom at war with itself,
a period where the traditional order was challenged, and the very nature of governance underwent subtle but significant changes. It is a chronicle of a changing military landscape, where the role of the knight began to evolve, and new technologies slowly emerged. And ultimately, it is the quiet story of how a series of dynastic struggles inadvertently paved the way for
a new royal dynasty, the Tudors, who would usher England into a new era. As the narrative unfolds, you may find your mind drifting, peacefully absorbing the information.
Our aim is not to overwhelm, but to gently inform, allowing the details of this long-past era to settle softly upon your consciousness.
There will be no drama, no hurried pace, only a steady, measured exploration of historical facts. Each chapter will build upon the last, gradually revealing the multifaceted nature of the Wars of the Roses. The seeds of the Wars of the Roses were sown long before the first battle was fought, deeply rooted in the complexities of English dynastic succession and the political landscape of the 14th and early 15th centuries. To truly understand the origins, we must gently trace the lineage of the Plantagenet kings, particularly from the reign of Edward III, whose numerous offspring inadvertently created the very pool of rival claimants that would eventually plunge England into civil war. King Edward III, who ruled from 1327 to 1377, was a highly successful monarch, presiding over a period of military triumph and relative stability.
He had a large family, and it is through his sons that the rival claims to the throne would later emerge. His eldest son, Edward, the Black Prince, died before his father, leaving a young son, Richard. This grandson ascended the throne as Richard II. However, Richard II's reign was marked by increasing absolutism and unpopularity, leading to a pivotal moment in English history in 1399. In that year, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of Edward II's third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, returned from exile and successfully usurped the throne from Richard II, becoming King Henry IV.
This act was significant because it broke the traditional line of succession.
While Henry IV claimed the throne by right of conquest and parliamentary assent, his claim was technically weaker by strict primogeniture than the descendants of Edward II's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence.
The Lancastrian claim was thus based on parliamentary recognition and military strength, rather than an unassailable hereditary right. This inherent weakness in the Lancastrian title would remain a latent vulnerability for decades. The Lancastrian dynasty, comprising Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, managed to maintain control for over half a century.
Henry V, in particular, was a formidable warrior king, whose victories against France in the 100 Years' War, most famously at Agincourt in 1415, brought immense prestige and diverted aristocratic energies outwards. His early death in 1422, however, left a 9-month-old infant, Henry VI, on the throne, ushering in a long and tumultuous minority. It is during this minority, and the subsequent adult reign of Henry VI, that the conditions for the Wars of the Roses truly began to coalesce. Henry VI grew into a gentle, pious, and scholarly man, but he lacked the strong leadership qualities, political acumen, and military prowess necessary to effectively govern a kingdom and manage its ambitious nobility.
He was prone to periods of mental instability, which further exacerbated the power vacuum at the heart of government. The ongoing 100 Years' War in France also played a critical role.
By the mid-15th century, England was suffering significant defeats, culminating in the loss of nearly all its French territories, save for Calais, by 1453.
The humiliation of these losses, coupled with the financial strain of the prolonged conflict,
led to widespread disillusionment and discontent among the English nobility and gentry.
Soldiers returning from France, often unemployed and unpaid, contributed to an atmosphere of lawlessness and instability. Against this backdrop, powerful noble factions began to emerge, vying for control and influence over the weak king. The most
prominent of these was Richard, Duke of York.
Richard was descended from Edward III through 2 lines. Through his father, he was the great-grandson of Edward II's fourth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York,
and more importantly, through his mother and Mortimer, he was the great-great-grandson of Edward II's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence. This second lineage gave him a claim to the throne that, by strict hereditary right, was superior to that of the reigning Lancastrian king, Henry VI. Initially, Richard of York sought to govern England as the king's chief minister, not to usurp the throne.
He desired to restore good government, reduce corruption, and address the financial woes of the kingdom. However, he found himself increasingly at odds with other powerful factions at court, notably those led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset,
a close ally of Queen Margaret of Anjou.
Queen Margaret, a strong-willed and determined woman, became the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause, fiercely protective of her husband's rights and those of her son, Prince Edward. She deeply distrusted Richard of York, and saw him as a direct threat to the Lancastrian dynasty. The simmering rivalry escalated into open conflict in the early 1450s.
Henry VI's first period of severe mental incapacitation in 1453 provided a critical turning point.
During this time, the powerful Queen Margaret was excluded from the regency, and Richard of York was appointed protector of the realm.
York used this opportunity to imprison Somerset and assert his authority.
However, when Henry VI unexpectedly
recovered in 1455, he reversed many of York's decisions, released Somerset, and restored the Queen's allies to power.
This reinstatement of York's rivals directly led to the first armed clash, and so, as the quiet echoes of court intrigue and dynastic grievances fade, we recognize that the Wars of the Roses did not erupt suddenly, but emerged from a complex interplay of weak kingship, disputed succession, the fallout from foreign wars, and the ambitions of powerful noble families. The stage was set, not with a single dramatic flourish, but with the slow, persistent accumulation of resentments and rival claims, leading England to the brink of a profound internal struggle.
Daily life, customs, and social roles, having quietly established the origins of the Wars of the Roses, let us now gently turn our attention to the intricate tapestry of daily life, the customs that subtly shifted, and the distinct social roles that both defined and were redefined by the ongoing conflict.
While the popular image of these was often conjures scenes of constant battle and widespread devastation, the reality for many was more nuanced, a blend of intermittent disruption and the enduring rhythms of medieval existence. For the vast majority
of the population, the peasants, who constituted the overwhelming majority life, remained largely tied to the land and the agricultural calendar.
Their daily routines of planting, harvesting, and tending livestock continued, driven by the seasons rather than the shifting fortunes of distant battles. However, the wars did bring significant anxieties and intermittent hardships. Armies on the march, where the Lancastrian or Yorkist often lived of the land, requisitioning food, livestock, and supplies, which could devastate local communities. Soldiers, often unpaid, might resort to looting and pillaging, leaving a trail of destruction. Feudal obligations sometimes meant that peasants were called upon to serve their local lord, either directly in battle or in support roles. While formal
conscription was rare, local levies might be raised, and the threat of forced service hung over many.
The general breakdown of law and order in certain regions, particularly those directly affected by campaigns, meant increased vulnerability to banditry and lawlessness, as traditional authorities were undermined or distracted by the conflict.
Yet, in areas remote from the main theatres of war, life could continue with a surprising degree of normalcy, a quiet testament to resilience for the gentry and lesser nobility, those below the great magnates but above the peasantry. The wars brought both peril and opportunity.
Their loyalty was often deeply personal, tied to their immediate overlord, their familial connections, or their local interests.
Switching allegiance was not uncommon, driven by pragmatism, survival, or a genuine change in conviction. They supplied men for the armies, either their own retainers or local levies, and bore the brunt of local administrative duties.
Their estates might be targeted for plunder by opposing forces, or confiscated if their side lost.
However, for some, the wars also offered a chance to rise in status, to gain new lands or influence through valor in battle or astute political maneuvering. The powerful magnates, the dukes, earls, and barons, were the primary protagonists of the Wars of the Roses.
Their lives were dominated by politics, military strategy, and the intricate dance of alliances and rivalries. They maintained vast networks of retainers on men clad in their distinctive livery uniforms and bound
by maintenance contracts of service.
These private armies, often larger and better equipped than the king's own forces, were both a source of their power and a major destabilizing factor, as they could be deployed against rivals or even the crown itself.
For these noble families,
the stakes were incredibly high. The potential for immense wealth and influence or complete ruin attained a loss of land and title and even execution. Noble women, while not directly fighting, played crucial roles. They managed estates in
the absence of their husbands, protected family lands, and acted as political agents, negotiating alliances and raising heirs.
Queen Margaret of Anjou stands as a prime example, a formidable political and military leader who spearheaded the Lancastrian cause for many years.
Many noblewomen endured immense personal losses, seeing husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers, fall in battle or be executed. Their customs often dictated a stoic endurance, yet the emotional toll would have been profound. The customs of medieval society, such as chivalry, continue to exist, though they were often strained and sometimes outright broken by the realities of civil war.
While there were instances of chivalrous conduct, such as sparing noble prisoners for ransom, the intense personal animosity and the desire to eliminate rivals often led to the summary execution of defeated opponents, particularly after decisive battles.
The concept of loyalty was paramount, yet it was frequently tested and broken as allegiances shifted with the tides of fortune. Urban life, particularly in larger towns and cities, could also be significantly impacted.
While cities often enjoyed royal charters that granted them a degree of autonomy, they were not immune. They might be besieged, forced to choose a side, or compelled to quarter armies.
However, many cities attempted to maintain neutrality, prioritizing their trade and economic stability.
The merchant class, while also seeking to avoid direct conflict, benefited from the increased demand for certain goods and from opportunities arising from the disruption of traditional supply lines.
Guilds continued to organize craft production
and commerce, providing a stable framework for urban economic activity even amidst the broader political instability. Public spectacle remained an important part of life, even during the wars. Royal entries into cities, though sometimes with a victorious king rather than a long-reigning one, continued to be celebrated. Religious festivals, processions, and local fairs provided moments of respite and continuity, reminding people of
a world beyond the immediate conflict.
The use of heraldry and distinctive badges, such as the red and white roses, became deeply ingrained in visual culture, allowing people to identify allegiances and fostering a sense of partisan identity, often quietly, through subtle display. And so, as the quiet echoes of everyday life and the subtle shifts in social structures fade,
we understand that the Wars of the Roses, while undoubtedly a period of great upheaval, did not halt the fundamental rhythms of medieval existence. For many, life continued, albeit with an added layer of uncertainty and peril.
The conflict subtly
reshaped loyalties, tested resilience, and forced individuals at every level of society to navigate a precarious world where their choices or lack thereof could have profound consequences. Religion, beliefs, and mythology. As we softly move through the historical landscape of the Wars of the Roses, it becomes evident that religion, particularly Roman Catholicism, continued to be an omnipresent force, deeply embedded in the beliefs and daily lives of the English populace.
While the conflict itself was dynastic and political, the Church played a significant, albeit sometimes complex, role, influencing perceptions, moral justifications, and the broader worldview during this turbulent era. The Roman Catholic Church remained the dominant religious institution across England, with the Pope in Rome at its spiritual head.
Its hierarchical structure, from archbishops and bishops to parish priests, permeated society, reaching into every village and town.
For the vast majority, the Church provided the fundamental framework for understanding the world, salvation through faith and good works, the fear of eternal damnation, and the hope of heaven.
The sacraments, baptism, confession, communion,
marriage, and last rites marked the crucial stages of life, providing spiritual comfort and communal cohesion during the Wars of the Roses. Both Lancastrian and Yorkist factions sought to legitimize their claims to the throne through divine
sanction. Kings, whether de facto or de jure, were understood to rule by the grace of God.
Therefore, gaining the Church's endorsement was highly desirable.
Chroniclers, often clerics themselves, would present their preferred monarch's cause as righteous
and divinely favored, subtly weaving narratives that supported one side over the other.
Sermons, delivered from pulpits across the country, could influence public opinion, urging loyalty to the reigning monarch or, more subtly, questioning the legitimacy of a rival. However, the Church itself was not immune to the political divisions.
While its overarching structure remained intact, individual clerics, from bishops down to parish priests, often held personal loyalties to specific noble families or royal factions. Some prominent churchmen, such as George Neville, Archbishop
of York, became deeply embroiled in the political maneuvering, actively supporting one side or another.
Their influence could be significant, acting as negotiators, diplomats, or even recruiters.
Yet, for the most part, The church sought to maintain its own authority and preserve peace, often attempting to mediate between the warring parties.
Ecclesiastical.
Councils and individual bishops frequently tried to broker truces and achieve reconciliation. Though often with limited long-term success, popular piety remained strong amidst the conflict. People continue to attend Mass, participate in religious festivals, and venerate saints.
Indeed, in times of uncertainty and upheaval, devotion often intensified as individuals sought divine protection and solace. Pilgrimages to holy sites, such as Canterbury Cathedral or Walsingham, continued, although they might be disrupted by local skirmishes or the general insecurity of travel.
Belief in miracles, the power of relics, and the efficacy of prayers was widespread, offering a sense of hope in a world often dominated by fear and violence, while there was no widespread mythology associated with the Wars of the Roses in a
traditional sense. Both sides employed symbolic and quasi-mythic elements in their propaganda. The white and red roses, initially just personal badges, became powerful visual symbols of the conflict, imbuing the struggle with a deeper, almost elemental, significance of purity versus passion, or rightful lineage versus usurpation.
The idea of divine judgment, that God would ultimately reveal the true king through the outcome of battle, was a pervasive belief.
For instance, after the decisive victory at Bosworth, Henry Tudor's success was often presented as God's will, confirming his divinely ordained right to rule. The concept of accursed or unjust lineage was also utilized. The Lancastrians, stemming from Henry IV's usurpation, faced constant accusations of illegitimacy.
Conversely, the Yorkists, particularly Richard III, later faced accusations of having usurped his nephew's throne and of being divinely punished, even inspiring narratives that bordered on the folkloric, such as the stories surrounding the princes.
In the Tower, these narratives, while often rooted in political expediency, tapped into deeply held beliefs about justice, divine retribution, and the rightful order of kingship. Prophecy and omens also played a role in the popular imagination. Astrologers and seers were consulted, and popular belief in signs and portents could influence morale. The appearance of comets or unusual weather phenomena might be interpreted as divine warnings or endorsements for one side or the other.
These informal beliefs, though not sanctioned by official church doctrine, were part of the rich tapestry of medieval thought and provided a way for people to interpret and find meaning in the unpredictable chaos around them. And so, as the quiet echoes of prayers, the solemnity of Mass, and the subtle whispers of popular belief fade, we understand that religion provided a fundamental framework for life during the Wars of the Roses.
It was a source of comfort, a justification for power, and a lens through which the turbulent events were interpreted. While the conflict was earthly in its origins, the spiritual realm remained deeply intertwined with the human struggle for the crown, subtly guiding perceptions and offering.
A sense of order amidst profound disorder. Government, laws, and leaders, having gently explored the spiritual undercurrents, let us now turn our quiet attention to the practical structures of power that were severely tested and profoundly reshaped during the Wars of the Roses. The evolving forms of government, the applications of law, and the dynamic roles of the leaders who navigated and often succumbed to the fierce struggle for the English crown.
The conflict fundamentally challenged the established norms of medieval governance, exposing its inherent weaknesses and ultimately paving the way for a more centralized monarchy. At the outset of the wars, England's government was fundamentally
monarchical, but its power was significantly constrained by the powerful nobility and the growing, though still limited, influence of Parliament.
The king was theoretically supreme, but his ability to govern effectively depended heavily on his personal qualities, his financial resources, and his ability to command the loyalty and cooperation of the leading magnates.
The reign of Henry
VIII, marked by his youth, piety, and later, debilitating mental illness, perfectly illustrated the perils of a weak monarchy in a system that relied so heavily on royal strength. Henry VI's incapacitation in 1453 created a power vacuum that a strong
king would have filled. Instead, it led to the appointment of Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm.
This period saw York attempting to restore order, reduce the enormous royal debt, and curb the influence of what he perceived as corrupt Lancastrian favourites.
His actions, however, were often seen as a direct challenge to the authority of Queen Margaret and the Lancastrian faction. further fueling the animosity. The king's recovery in 1455 immediately reversed York's policies, demonstrating the fragility
of any government not directly supported by the monarch's stable will. The laws of the land, based on common law, parliamentary statutes, and royal prerogative, were frequently undermined by the pervasive instability. Justice became increasingly
politicized.
Accusations of treason, often leveled against the losing side, led to acts of attainder parliamentary acts that stripped individuals of their lands, titles, and civil rights without trial, effectively condemning them. This practice, used extensively by both Lancastrians and Yorkists against their opponents, became a powerful tool of political warfare, allowing winning factions to enrich themselves and punish their enemies. It fostered an atmosphere of profound insecurity, as loyalty to the wrong side could mean total ruin for an entire family. Parliament, while called frequently by both sides to legitimate their claims and raise funds, often became an instrument of factional power rather than an independent body. Its role was to rubber stamp the victories of the prevailing faction, passing acts of attainder and confirming new successions. However, the very fact that both sides felt the need to convene Parliament and seek its assent demonstrates its growing importance as a source of legitimacy. Even if its independence was compromised, key leaders emerged from both factions, their personalities and strategies profoundly shaping the course of the wars. On the Lancastrian side,
King Henry VI, a gentle
but ineffective king, prone to mental illness. His weakness was a primary cause of the conflict, and his alternating periods of lucidity and catatonia made stable governance impossible. Queen Margaret of Anjou, a formidable and determined queen, Margaret effectively became the military and political leader of the Lancastrian cause. She was an intelligent and fierce advocate for her husband and son, personally leading armies and tirelessly raising support.
Her strength and uncompromising nature, however, often alienated potential allies and hardened the resolve of the Yorkists. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and later his son, Henry Beaufort, a leading Lancastrian magnate, often seen as Henry VI's chief advisor and a rival to Richard of York.
The personal animosity between the Yorkists and the Beaufort family was a significant driver of the early conflict. On the Yorkist side, Richard, Duke of York, the initial claimant to the throne, not always aspiring to kingship but rather to good government and the exclusion of Lancastrian favourites.
His strong hereditary claim and ambition set the conflict in motion.
He was a skilled military leader and administrator, but ultimately fell in battle. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, one of the wealthiest and most powerful
magnates in England, Warwick initially championed the Yorkist cause, playing a decisive role in placing Edward IV on the throne. His vast wealth, extensive network of retainers, and strategic brilliance earned him his famous epithet.
However, his ambition and eventual disillusionment with Edward IV led him to switch allegiance back to the Lancastrians, briefly restoring
Henry VI, a testament to his immense power to influence the course of events. King Edward IV, Richard of York's eldest son, a charismatic, militarily gifted, and politically astute leader. Edward seized the throne in 1461, proving to be an effective
monarch who brought a period of relative stability. He was able to command loyalty and consolidate power through a combination of military victories, shrewd governance, and effective propaganda. King Richard III, Edward IV's younger brother, who usurped the throne from his young nephews, the princes, in the Tower in 1483.
His brief reign was characterized by attempts to centralize power and introduce legal reforms, but also by deep suspicion and controversy surrounding the fate of the princes, which significantly undermined his legitimacy and support. The constant shifts in power, the battles, the attainders, and the executions of defeated leaders created an environment of profound instability.
The traditional feudal system, with its emphasis on loyalty and reciprocal obligations, was stretched to its breaking point. However, the very chaos of the wars inadvertently prepared the ground for a stronger, more centralized monarchy. The old nobility, weakened by generations of internecine conflict and attrition on the battlefield, lost much of its former power.
This facilitated the rise of the Tudor dynasty, which would consolidate royal authority and usher in a new era of governance. And
so, as the quiet echoes of parliamentary debates, the solemn pronouncements of legal judgments, and the determined voices of kings and queens fade, we gain a profound understanding of how the Wars of the Roses fundamentally challenged the structures of English government, the weakness of a king, the ambition of magnates, and the shifting sands of loyalty created an unstable foundation, ultimately leading to a period of intense conflicts that would forever alter the balance of power within the realm, quietly paving the way for a new era of royal authority. Cities, infrastructure, and architecture. As we gently shift our focus, let us now contemplate the physical spaces of England during the Wars of the Roses, the bustling cities, the practical infrastructure that supported limited travel and trade, and the resilient architecture that bore witness to and sometimes suffered from the widespread conflict. While the wars were largely fought in the countryside, the urban centres played crucial roles as strategic strongholds, sources of wealth and points of political loyalty. Medieval cities, particularly in England, were typically walled, offering a degree of protection against external threats and providing a clear demarcation between urban life and the surrounding rural landscape. These walls, often substantial, sometimes became focal points of conflict, subjected to sieges and assaults. For instance, cities like London, York, and Coventry, with their strategic locations and wealth, were vital prizes for both Lancastrian and Yorkist factions. Their allegiance could shift depending on who held military dominance in the region, or who offered the most favourable terms. Inside the city walls, life continued amidst the turmoil. Streets were typically narrow and winding, leading to a central market square where commerce and social life converged. Buildings were closely packed, often timber-framed with upper stories overhanging the streets. While generally untouched by pitched battles, cities could suffer immense damage during sieges. Prolonged blockades could lead to starvation and disease, and direct assaults might result in widespread destruction from fire, artillery, or the systematic dismantling of defences. The inhabitants of besieged cities faced immense hardship and anxiety, their daily lives entirely dictated by the ebb and flow of the siege. Infrastructure within these developing cities was pragmatic. Wells and communal pumps provided water, and rudimentary drainage systems were sometimes in place, though sanitation remained a persistent challenge, contributing to outbreaks of disease, especially during sieges when populations swelled or conditions deteriorated. Bridges, often stone, were vital strategic points, controlling access to and from cities, and allowing the movement of armies and goods across rivers. Control of key river crossings and bridges was often a crucial military objective, as seen in various campaigns. The network of roads, mostly unpaved and subject to seasonal conditions, facilitated the movement of armies, though often slowly and with great difficulty, especially when transporting heavy artillery or supplies. Architecturally, the period of the Wars of the Roses saw the continuation of the late Gothic style in England, known as the Perpendicular style, characterized by its emphasis on vertical lines, large windows, and intricate fan vaulting. Many churches and cathedrals, often already centuries old, continued to be built or renovated during this period, despite the conflict. The construction of these grand religious edifices was a long-term undertaking, often spanning generations, a quiet testament to enduring faith even in turbulent times. While no new major cathedrals were initiated, existing ones continued to be embellished or repaired. The very presence of these structures offered a sense of continuity and permanence amidst the political upheaval. Castles, the fortified residences of the nobility, played a paramount role in the Wars of the Roses. They served as administrative centres, defensive strongholds, and symbols of their lord's power and allegiance. Many existing castles were refortified or adapted to withstand more advanced siege warfare, including the increasing use of gunpowder artillery. New castles were rarely built, but strategic older ones, such as Pontefract, Ludlow, or the Tower of London, changed hands multiple times, becoming critical prizes in the conflict. The sieges of these castles, often protracted affairs, highlighted the transition in military technology, as cannons became increasingly effective at breaching traditional stone defences. Manor houses, the residences of the gentry, also reflected the need for security, often incorporating defensive features like moats or fortified gatehouses, though they were less formidable than true castles. For the common people, houses remained simple, primarily timber-framed structures with thatched roofs, built to local specifications and materials. The practicalities of construction and the local availability of resources dictated much of the domestic architecture.
The impact of the wars on architecture and infrastructure was primarily one of disruption, destruction, and delayed development rather than fundamental change. Battles often occurred in rural areas, devastating villages and farmlands.
Castles and towns caught in the crossfire could suffer severe damage, requiring costly repairs that might be postponed due to the ongoing conflict. The economic strain of the wars meant that resources that might otherwise have been invested in new building projects or infrastructure improvements were diverted to military expenditure. And so, as the quiet echoes of city life, the distant sounds of siege engines, and the persistent presence of ancient stone fade,
we gain a visual sense of England during the Wars of the Roses.
From the formidable walls of its cities and castles to the enduring beauty of its churches, these physical spaces tell a story of both vulnerability and resilience.
They stand as silent witnesses to a period of profound upheaval, where the physical landscape, like the political one, was subtly but persistently shaped by the ebb and flow of conflict. Economy, trade and technology. As we quietly delve deeper into the fabric of England during the Wars of the Roses, let us now illuminate the practicalities of daily sustenance and the underlying economic conditions, the systems that underpinned
society, the networks of trade that continued, albeit with disruption, and the subtle but significant advancements in military technology that influenced the course of the conflict. The English economy in the mid-15th century was primarily agrarian, but also featured growing urban centres and an expanding international trade. At the heart of the English economy lay agriculture. The vast majority of the population derived their livelihood directly from farming, cultivating cereals like wheat, barley, and oats, and raising livestock. The manor, as the basic unit of land ownership and agricultural organization, remained central, though the system of serfdom was in decline, hastened by demographic changes following the Black Death.
Peasants increasingly worked as free tenants, or leaseholders, paying rents in money or kind, rather than solely through labor service.
This slow shift towards a more commercialized agricultural economy was already underway before the wars. The wars themselves had a complex impact on the economy.
On one hand, regions directly affected by battles, sieges, or the movement of large
armies could suffer immense disruption and damage.
Crops might be trampled, villages plundered or burned, and livestock seized.
This led to localized economic hardship, food shortages, and displacement. The general insecurity also made long-distance trade more perilous, increasing costs and risks for merchants.
The constant demand for funds to finance the wars led to increased taxation and the frequent imposition of forced loans by the crown,
which further strained the economy. On the other hand, the economic impact was not uniformly negative across the entire kingdom. Some areas, particularly those far from the main theatres of conflict, experienced relatively little direct disruption.
The wars also created demand for certain goods and services, such as weapons, armor, textiles for livery, and provisions for armies, which could stimulate local industries. Mercenary soldiers, when paid, would also inject money into the local economy.
However, the overall effect was certainly one of economic stress and instability, diverting resources from productive investment. Trade, both domestic and international, was a vital component of the English economy.
Wool and woolen cloth were England's most important exports, forming the bedrock of its wealth.
Merchants, organized into powerful guilds like the Company of the Staple for Wool Export and the Merchant Adventurers for Finished Cloth, facilitated this trade.
England's principal trading partners included the Low Countries Burgundy, the Hanseatic League in the Baltic, and to a lesser extent, the Italian city-states. The Wars of the Roses did disrupt these trade networks. The political instability at home, and the shifting alliances with foreign powers, particularly Burgundy,
which sometimes supported the Yorkists, could interrupt traditional trade routes and create uncertainty for merchants. Pirates, often operating with unofficial sanction from one faction or another, also posed a significant threat to shipping. However, the fundamental demand for English goods, particularly wool and cloth, meant that trade largely continued, adapting to the changing political climate. Merchants often tried to remain neutral or to secure protection from whichever faction controlled their region. In terms of technology, the Wars of the Roses occurred during a period of transition, particularly in military advancements. While traditional medieval weapons such as swords, lances, and bows, especially the English longbow, which continued to be highly effective, remained dominant, Gunpowder weapons were increasingly making their presence felt.
Cannons, initially cumbersome and unreliable, became more powerful and effective in siege warfare.
They were used by both sides to batter castle walls and city defences, signalling the slow decline of the traditional medieval castle as an impregnable stronghold.
Handguns, though still primitive and less common than bows, also saw some use on
the battlefield. Naval technology also played a role.
While no major fleet engagements occurred, control of the seas, particularly the English Channel, was crucial for securing supply lines, transporting troops, and preventing invasion. Fleets, often composed of armed merchant ships pressed into service, were used to move armies, as seen in Edward Ivy's return from exile.
Navigation and shipbuilding techniques continued to evolve, though perhaps not dramatically during this specific period of conflict. Other technological advancements continued quietly in the background, largely unrelated to the wars. Agricultural implements, milling technologies, watermills and windmills, and various craft tools saw gradual improvements. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in Germany in the mid-15th century, was just beginning to make its way to England towards
the very end of the Wars of the Roses,
with William Caxton establishing the first English printing press in 1476. While its immediate impact on the wars was negligible, it represented a revolutionary change in communication and the dissemination of knowledge that would profoundly shape the subsequent Tudor era. And so,
as the quiet hum of the market, the distant clatter of the weaver's loom, and the muted roar of nascent cannons fade, we perceive an English economy that, while resilient, was significantly affected by the Wars of the Roses.
Trade continued, but often with increased risk. Agriculture remained the bedrock, but localized disruption was common. And in military technology, the period marked a subtle but irreversible shift towards gunpowder, quietly signaling the end of one era of warfare and the dawn of another, transforming the very nature of conflict. Conflict, decline, or cultural transformation. As we gently approach the climactic chapters of our quiet journey through the Wars of the Roses, we must now directly confront the periods of intense conflict, the moments of decisive action, and the profound human cost that ultimately led to a significant cultural and political transformation in England.
The Wars of the Roses were not a single, continuous war, but rather a series of intermittent armed conflicts, punctuated by uneasy truces and brief periods of peace, spanning over 3 decades. The initial spark of open warfare occurred at the
First Battle of St. Albans in 1455. This was more of a skirmish than a full-scale battle, but its outcome was highly significant. Richard, Duke of York, and his allies, most notably Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, engaged a royal Lancastrian force. The battle was a decisive Yorkist victory, resulting in the death of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, York's bitter rival, and marking the beginning of the open conflict between the houses.
King Henry VI was captured, and York again became
protector.
This quiet moment of victory for York set a dangerous precedent. Open rebellion against the crown that proved successful. The next few years saw a fluctuating struggle, marked by shifting alliances and further engagements.
The Battle of Blore Heath won for 5-9 saw a Yorkist victory, but was followed by the Battle of Ludford Bridge won for 5-9, where the Yorkist leaders were forced to flee the country. However, Warwick, having gathered forces in Calais, returned, leading to the Battle of Northampton won for 6-0.
Here, Warwick decisively defeated the Lancastrians, capturing King Henry VI once again.
Richard of York now openly claimed the throne, leading to the Act of Accord, which stipulated that Henry VI would remain king for his lifetime. But Richard of York or his heirs would succeed him, disinheriting Henry's own son, Prince Edward. This disinheritance was unacceptable to Queen Margaret, who rallied Lancastrian forces. In December 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, the Lancastrians achieved a crushing victory. Richard of York was killed, and his head was famously displayed on the gates of York. His son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was also killed.
This Lancastrian triumph seemed to signal the end of the Yorkist challenge, but it only spurred on York's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, a young, charismatic, and militarily brilliant leader. Edward quickly raised new forces, and after another
Lancastrian victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans won for 6-1, where Henry VI was recaptured by his wife, Edward marched on London. With popular and parliamentary support, he was proclaimed King Edward IV in March 1461.
His immediate task was to crush the remaining Lancastrian resistance.
This led to the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, the Battle of Towton, won for 6-1.
Fought in a snowstorm, it was a brutal, prolonged engagement resulting in a decisive Yorkist victory and immense casualties. Henry VI, Margaret, and their son fled into exile. Towton effectively secured Edward Ivy's throne for a decade, signalling a period of relative quiet. Edward Ivy's reign, 1 for 6-1, 1 for 7-0, brought some stability. He proved an able administrator, restoring order and engaging in shrewd diplomacy.
However, his relationship with his most powerful supporter, Warwick the Kingmaker, began to sour.
Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, alienated
Warwick, who had been negotiating a marriage alliance with a European princess. Warwick, feeling marginalized and disrespected, eventually switched his allegiance, allying with Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou. This led to the re-election of
Henry VI, 1 for 7-0, 1 for 7-1.
Warwick successfully invaded England, forcing Edward IV into exile in Burgundy.
Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne, but his second reign was short-lived. Edward IV, with Burgundian support, returned to England in 1471, rallying his forces. He met and defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, 1 for 7-1, where the Kingmaker himself was killed.
Just weeks later, Edward crushed the last major Lancastrian army, led by Queen Margaret and her son Prince Edward, at the Battle of Tewkesbury,
1 for 7-1.
Prince Edward was killed during or shortly after the battle, and Henry VI died in the Tower of London shortly thereafter, officially of natural causes, though widely suspected to have been murdered on Edward Ivy's orders. These two battles, Barnet
and Tewkesbury, effectively brought an end to the direct Lancastrian line and ushered in a sustained period of Yorkist rule under Edward IV.
The conflict seemed to have ended, with Edward firmly on the throne and no clear Lancastrian alternative. The final phase of the wars was triggered by the unexpected death of Edward IV in 1483. His young son, Edward V, was proclaimed king, but his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, rapidly seized power.
Richard quickly moved to establish himself as protector, questioning the legitimacy of Edward Ivy's marriage and thus the claims of his nephews.
The young King Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were confined to the Tower
of London and famously disappeared, leading to the enduring mystery of the princes in the Tower.
Richard, Duke of Gloucester, then claimed the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III.
His usurpation, while perhaps intended to prevent further instability from a child king, profoundly alienated many key figures and tarnished his reign.
With lasting controversy, Richard II's short and troubled reign faced immediate challenges.
Many who had supported Edward IV were disaffected by Richard's actions.
This paved the way for the emergence of Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant, who had been living in exile in Brittany and France.
Henry, whose claim was tenuous but who represented the last hope for the Lancastrian cause, gained support from disaffected Yorkists and Lancastrians alike. The climactic battle of the Wars of the Roses, and indeed of the Plantagenet dynasty, was the Battle of Bosworth Field, 1 for 8-5. Henry Tudor, with French support, landed in Wales and marched into England, gathering forces.
Richard III, commanding a larger army, met him on a field in Leicestershire. The battle was fiercely contested, but the decisive intervention of the Stanley family, who switched their allegiance from Richard to Henry at a critical moment, turned the tide.
Richard III was famously killed in battle, the last English king.
To suffer such a fate, Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, immediately consolidated his victory. He symbolically married Elizabeth of York, Edward Ivy's daughter, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster through his own tenuous claim and York. This union was symbolized by the Tudor rose, combining the red and white roses,
while pockets of resistance and pretenders emerged, such as Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. The Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, where Simnel's forces were defeated, is often considered the final battle of the Wars of the Roses, effectively cementing Tudor rule. And so, as the echoes of trumpets and the quiet clash of steel fade, we witness the profound transformation wrought by these conflicts. The Wars of the Roses, marked by a cycle of usurpation, battle, and shifting
loyalties, brought an end to the Plantagenet dynasty and ushered in the Tudors. This long period of intense conflict, while devastating for many, inadvertently weakened the powerful old nobility, clearing the path for a stronger, more centralized monarchy that would define the subsequent era of English history. A quiet, yet monumental shift.
Historical legacy and modern influence. As our quiet journey through the Wars of the Roses gently draws to a close, let us now reflect upon the enduring historical legacy of this tumultuous period and the pervasive ways in which its influence continues to shape our understanding of English history, politics, and culture.
Far from being merely a series of obscure battles, the Wars of the Roses left an indelible mark, paving the way for a new royal dynasty and subtly altering the trajectory of England's development. Perhaps the most direct and profound legacy of
The Wars of the Roses was the rise of the Tudor dynasty.
the victory of Henry Tudor at Bosworth Field in 1485, and his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York, brought an end to the Plantagenet era and established a new royal house that would
Rule England for over a century.
The Tudors, particularly Henry VII and his son Henry VIII, were keenly aware of the instability that had plagued their predecessors. Consequently, their reigns were characterized by a deliberate and successful effort to centralize royal power, suppress remaining noble opposition, and establish a more stable and efficient administration. This strengthening of the monarchy was a direct consequence of the widespread weakening of the old feudal nobility, who had been decimated by attrition on the battlefield, attainder, and execution during the wars. The Tudor regime emerged from
The chaos with a clear mandate to establish strong, undisputed rule. The decline of the old nobility is another crucial legacy.
generations of internecine conflict had a devastating effect on many of England's ancient aristocratic families. Their numbers were reduced, their wealth dissipated, and their private army's livery and maintenance were gradually suppressed by the Tudors, who preferred to rely on royal authority and a centralized military. This shift fundamentally altered the balance of power within England, making it easier for the monarchy to exert its will without facing constant challenges from powerful magnates.
A new, more loyal nobility, often drawn from the gentry or rising merchant class, gradually emerged to serve the Tudor crown. The wars also contributed to the strengthening of royal justice and administration.
The chaos and breakdown of local
Order during the conflict highlighted the need for a more effective and centralized system of justice. Henry VII, in particular, worked to restore peace and order, using new legal instruments and royal courts, such as the Star Chamber, to enforce royal authority and ensure that the law applied to all, even the powerful.
This process laid important
Groundwork for the development of a more sophisticated and centralized state apparatus. In terms of national identity, the Wars of the Roses, ironically, may have contributed to a nascent sense of Englishness.
While loyalties during the wars were often highly localized or dynastic, the conclusion of the conflict under a single, strong ruler, who actively promoted a unified national narrative, began to foster a broader sense of collective identity. The Tudor Rose itself became a powerful symbol of unity and reconciliation after decades of division, emphasizing peace and stability under the new dynasty. Culturally, the Wars of the Roses left a deep impression. The most enduring influence is perhaps found in literature. William Shakespeare's historical plays, particularly Richard III and the three parts of Henry VIII, though written a century after the events, profoundly shaped popular perceptions of the conflict and its key figures. While Shakespeare often dramatized and took liberties with historical accuracy, particularly in his portrayal of Richard II, his plays became the primary lens through which many generations understood the Wars of the Roses. His vivid characters and dramatic narrative cemented the Red Rose vs. White Rose imagery in the public consciousness. Beyond Shakespeare, the Wars of the Roses have continued to inspire countless works of fiction, poetry, and historical scholarship. The complex web of characters, the dramatic turns of fortune, and the moral ambiguities of the conflict offer fertile ground for storytelling and analysis. Modern historical research, utilizing a wider range of sources and critical approaches, continues to refine our understanding of this period, often challenging popular myths while affirming the profound historical significance of the events. The very visual symbols of the wars, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York,
remain powerful and recognizable.
They are not merely historical relics but continue to be used in heraldry, as emblems of specific regions, for example the White Rose of Yorkshire, and as general symbols of dynastic struggle. The Tudor Rose, combining both, remains a significant emblem of English heritage, even in contemporary politics. Lessons are sometimes drawn from the Wars of the Roses regarding the perils of factionalism,
weak leadership, and unresolved succession issues. While modern political systems are vastly different, the underlying human dynamics of ambition, loyalty, and the pursuit of power often resonate across the centuries, and so, as the quiet echoes of this long and transformative era gently recede, we are left with a profound appreciation for its enduring impact. The Wars of the Roses were not a static interval, but a dynamic crucible where old orders crumbled and new foundations were quietly laid.
Its legacy is not found in grand, dramatic pronouncements, but in the persistent, underlying structures and ideas that continue to shape our understanding of English history and governance.
This quiet conquest of time reveals a past that is not
Truly past, but rather a living, breathing part of our shared human story.
as the night deepens further and a profound stillness settles around us. Our tranquil journey through the vast and intricate story of the Wars of the Roses gently draws to its close.
We have traversed a turbulent but profoundly significant period
Of English history, from the complex dynastic origins rooted in the Plantagenet lineage to the lasting legacy that shaped the very course of the English monarchy.
We have explored the quiet tension that simmered beneath the surface of 15th to 8th century England, a realm where a weak king and ambitious magnates created a volatile environment.
We have seen how the disputes over succession, the lingering resentments
from previous usurpations, and the fallout from the Hundred Years' War all contributed to an inevitable clash between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. This was a conflict not easily defined by simple good versus evil, but rather by shifting loyalties, pragmatic alliances, and the relentless pursuit of power by determined individuals. We have considered the daily lives of those who experienced
these wars, from the peasants whose routines were intermittently disrupted, yet often continued, to the powerful nobles whose very existence hung in the balance with each turn of fortune. We have observed how religion provided a profound framework for understanding and legitimizing the conflict, even as the church itself became entangled in the political maelstrom.
and we have examined the enduring architecture and fragile infrastructure
That bore witness to the violence, yet often stood as symbols of continuity and resilience. The Wars of the Roses were a crucible of change, particularly in the realm of governance and power. They exposed the vulnerabilities of a monarchy reliant on the personal strength of its ruler and the cooperation of its magnates. The cycle of battles, usurpations, and attainders ultimately weakened the old feudal aristocracy, paving the way for a new, more centralized form of royal authority.
This was not a swift, dramatic revolution, but a slow, quiet process of attrition and consolidation, culminating in the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Consider for a moment the profound human stories embedded within this grand narrative. The tenacity
Of Queen Margaret of Anjou, tirelessly fighting for her husband and son. The charisma and military prowess of Edward IV, who seized and largely held the crown.
the controversial and tragic figure of Richard III, whose brief reign remains a subject of debate.
And finally, the unlikely ascent of Henry Tudor, who, from
A tenuous claim and a life in exile, managed to unite the fractured realm and establish a new era. Each of these lives, with their triumphs and their tragedies, contributed to the rich tapestry of this period. The quiet conquest of this era lies not in the thunder of cavalry charges or the clash of steel, but in the slow, persistent impact of these events on the fabric of society.
It lies in the gradual shift of power, the subtle changes in the relationship between king and nobility, and the enduring legacy that continues to shape our understanding of English identity. The Wars of the Roses were a testament to the fact that even in periods of intense conflict, the underlying rhythms of life persist, and the seeds of future transformation are quietly sown.
As you drift towards rest, allow the factual details of this historical narrative to settle gently in your mind.
There is a profound comfort in understanding the past, in recognizing the long threads of continuity that connect us to those who lived centuries ago. The challenges they faced, the lessons they learned, and the legacies they left behind offer a quiet perspective on our own time. The Wars of the Roses, while a period of struggle, ultimately led to a new epoch for England, a transition born from the crucible of conflict.
May the tranquil echoes of medieval England, its disputed crowns, its shifting loyalties, and its ultimate path to unity, now lull you into a state of deep relaxation. Imagine the gentle flow of a river past an ancient castle, the soft whisper of wind through a forgotten battlefield, or the quiet contemplation within a long-standing cathedral. The story of the Wars of the Roses is a testament to the enduring human journey, a journey marked by both profound conflict and eventual resolution. And so, with the quiet conquest of the Wars of the Roses now complete in your mind, we bid you a peaceful farewell.
May your thoughts be calm, your spirit at ease, and your rest be deep and restorative.
The past, in all its factual richness, has offered its story, and now, as the night embraces you fully, may you find the serenity that only a journey through time, gently concluded, can provide. Sleep well.